All right, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and kick off the afternoon with our panel on the title of our conference, Modernism, Materiality, and Meaning. And we're welcoming three speakers. Michael. Oh, you can't hear me. I'm sorry. Should I? How's this? Okay. Michael Thurston is Helen Means Professor of English at Smith College. He's the author of several books on 20th century poetry and is currently at work on a study of Hemingway's In Our Time and a biography of F.O. Matheson. And his paper today is titled Hemingway's Paratextual Adventures in Our Time. We'll also be hearing from W. Scott Howard, who teaches poetics and poetry in the Department of English and Literary Arts at the University of Denver. He is founding editor of Reconfigurations, a journal for poetics and poetry / literature and culture, and is co-editor with Brock Russell of Poetics and Praxis After Objectivism, University of Iowa Press 2018. He's the author of two collections of poems, Ropes with Images by Ginger Knowlton from Delete Press in 2014, and Spinnakers from the Loon 2016. His critical monograph, Archive and Artifact, Susan Howe's Factual Telepathy, is forthcoming from Talisman House in 2019. His paper today is titled Colliding Phenomena, Susan Howe's Facing Pages and Sonic Materialisms. And we'll also be hearing from Liliane Weissberg, who's here at Penn. Liliane is the Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor in the School of Arts and Sciences and Professor of German and Comparative Literature here at Penn. We shared a floor of Williams for many years. She has published books in the fields of 19th and early 20th century literature, philosophy, and visual studies, and has also published widely on Hannah Arendt and critical theory. In the fall of 2018, she published two books, congratulations, Liliane, one on late 18th and early 19th century music culture in Berlin, and another on the role of commentary in German Jewish philosophy. She's now completing a critical edition and study of a Prussian Jewish spy during the French Revolution, and the present talk relates to her new book project on the postcard. And her talk today is titled In Circulation, Modern Literature, Art, and the Meaning of the Postcard. So please help me welcome these speakers.
Well, like everybody else, I'm going to open by thanking David for the invitation to speak at this conference. It is a rare thing to be at a conference where I feel like I've learned something that I really wanted to learn from every single paper, and this has been that. I'm going to try not to break the pattern. And it's been really cool to learn so much more about the Gotham Book Mart and about its holdings. I'm going to be talking about a book that I'm almost positive was never in Francis Steloff's possession or on the shelves of the Gotham Book Mart, the 1924 lowercase In Our Time, as we talk about it to distinguish it from the one that you're all more familiar with. I teach a class from time to time at Smith in our special collections library on modernist works in their original sites of publication. And I'm lucky to be at a place that has a lot of really cool stuff. We've got a great set of Wolf holdings. And so I can show students a booklet of Hope Merleys' Paris that Wolf set the type for and that she glued the cover on. And I was telling Camille yesterday, one of them almost fainted when she heard that as we were talking about that. But one of the artifacts that we have is the one I'm going to talk about today. That's this Hemingway 1924 In Our Time. And really this is a project that has grown out of my teaching, out of that teaching. Showing this book to my students got me interested in it. I had done some work on Three Mountains Press around Pound and the publication of a draft of 16 cantos from Three Mountains Press. But I got really into this book as an artifact whose paratexts and bibliographic text have signifying properties that are maybe worth tracing. So it's led to two projects, an article that's coming out this spring that really is sort of a close reading of this book, of its paratexts, and then a longer project that I'm working to finish that uses In Our Time as a sort of node through which to map a lot of modernist print culture. Looking at the places where Hemingway first published some of the stories that then appeared in the book, including journals that are part of the exhibit that David has put together downstairs. This quarter published a story that ended up in Our Time. Transatlantic Review that Hemingway sometimes co-edited with Ford Madox Ford published a story that ended up in Our Time. So this little book has led to an interest in that somewhat bigger book. What I'm going to try to do in this talk is suggest a little bit of both of these projects. But frankly, it's glorified show and tell, because it's a really cool book, and I want to share with you the coolness of this really cool book. You're familiar with the uppercase in Our Time. This is the book that alternates stories like Indian Camp or Big Two-Hearted River, famous Hemingway stories, with the prose vignettes that have come to be called interchapters. And this, what we are familiar with now, is the version that was published by Scribner in 1930. I'm sort of showing you steps along the way to that. And here's the star attraction. This is the In Our Time from Three Mountains Press, published in 1924. And what I'd like to do today is show how features such as the cover, the title page, the dedications, the paper upon which the book is printed contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of the intervention that Hemingway is making in this project, and or really two understandings that I'm chasing after here. I'm going to argue that these features, these paratextual or bibliographic features, sometimes do a work that I would call hermeneutic. They work along with features of the text for emphasis or complication. They resonate with the themes that really unify the book. And sometimes they produce what I'm going to call, following Pierre Bourdieu, positional effects. They invite from the reader certain protocols of reading. They inform the reader about the nature of the book that the reader is holding in their hand. They indicate some level of the book's prestige, or what Bourdieu would call its distinction. This book, Hemingway's first book of stories, was developed in response to an invitation by Ezra Pound. Three Mountains, a small press operated in Paris by the American expatriate Bill Bird, was to publish the first installment of Pound's cantos, as I mentioned, a draft of 16 cantos, in 1925. But in 1924, the poet was producing for Bird a series of books exploring the current state of English prose. And having read the 6 vignettes that Hemingway was to publish in the Little Review's April 1923 Exiles number, that's its cover, Pound asked Hemingway to contribute to this series. There's an advertisement for Hemingway's contribution to the series in the back of this issue of Little Review. So we know there, Three Mountains Press in Paris has this series, an inquest into the current state of English prose, in which Ernest Hemingway is going to publish something whose title was yet to be determined. Blank. By the way, this kind of ad, whether in magazines or, as I'll show you at the end of the talk, at the backs of books, is one of the really cool sort of paratextual episodes that alert you to the network in which the book or the artifact that you're looking at is participating. So you get the sense here that Hemingway is in company with Pound, for example. We'll see other companies for Hemingway that get established by things like this. They do a work that I think is comparable to the work of a table of contents in an issue of a magazine. So in the table of contents in this issue of Little Review, in which Hemingway's In Our Time appear, you find Mina Loy and Gertrude Stein and William Carlos Williams. All right, that's one way that we determine the network. People have looked a little more at these ads at the back, which I think are really fascinating, are yet really to be explored, and that's part of what I want to do in this longer project. There's the book again. In the article I'm drawing on for this talk, I show how choices at the levels of paratext and bibliographic text achieve important significance in the elaboration of the volume's themes. Specifically, I argue that the cover, the colophon, things like that, both contribute to thematic unity, especially the thematic focus on a relationship between this moment in our time and time, right? Temporal sort of questions and unity, specificity and universality. and how paper quality, typesetting, advertising offer these clues to the reader about what kind of book this is. And so I'm using these words, paratext and bibliographic text, and if you're in the biz, you know that paratext came to us from Gérard Genette in his 1987 book. Bibliographic text is Jerome McGann's, I think, more capacious and in some ways more useful term. McGann, for Genette, paratexts are those thresholds that you cross, right, on the way into or out of the text. For McGann, they are the material features of the substrate on which the text appears to us, right? So that's where paper and type and spacing even and those sorts of things matter. So what I want to suggest is that Hemingway's lowercase in our time, especially when examined alongside in our time, I hate air quotes, but that's the way to say, that's the Little Review, 6 vignettes. And in our time, whether the Bony and Liverite edition of 1925 or the slightly revised Scribner edition of 1930, offers a rich opportunity to reveal the signifying properties, the contribution to meaning making that are latent in paratexts and bibliographic texts. It's also just fun. And it's fun in part because I geek out over all this stuff, and you see Hemingway geeking out over all this stuff. Although he tries to distance himself from some of the geeking out in a way I'm going to say something about in just a minute. So I'm going to try as much as possible to not read at you, but to talk to you as I go through these images. I'm going to try at the same time to keep an eye on the clock and be a little disciplined, which is my way of saying I'm not going to say everything cool or interesting there is to say about any of the images I'm going to show you. I will try instead just to be suggestive about what I think some of their potential significances are. So on this cover, it's red printed on boards, a collage of literally ripped from the headlines. You've got excerpts from newspapers, their headlines, advertisements, bits of stories. Some are in English, some are in French, some are in Spanish, one is in Greek. The Greek one, I think, has a particular significance. The Greco-Turkish War of 1920 and 21 is all over this book thematically, especially in chapter 6, which is they shot the 6 cabinet ministers at dawn. So there's a sort of thematic calling out in this collage of the our time, what makes our time our time. Stories of violence, stories of warfare, stories of crime. Some of the Spanish excerpts are from bullfighting papers. And if you've read the prose vignettes, the interchapters of In Our Time, you know crime, war, grief and sorrow and murder and bullfighting are the topics. There are then hermeneutical possibilities, right? The themes of the prose pieces are highlighted by these, and positional suggestions. And I have to gloss positional, I hear. Well, do I have to gloss positional? I should. I'll tell you a little tiny bit of Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu writes that the literary landscape is, this is a quote, a field of forces, but it is also a field of struggles tending to transform or conserve this field of forces. When a writer takes a position, and Bourdieu writes a lot about position taking in the cultural field, when a writer takes a position, often through choices of theme or genre or style, but I'm arguing also through paratextual and bibliographic codes, the writer establishes a relationship with one or another of the forces in tension within that field, with or against centers of power, or what Bourdieu calls the, quote, specific profits, such as literary prestige, which are at stake in the field. And many of the material features of this In Our Time perform that work of position taking, locating the book in the cultural field of early 1920s print culture and aesthetic practice. So, for example, that lowercase spelling out, all lowercase spelling out of the title and the author's name, and in fact everything in the colophon. This is something that I think is a move on, it's a position taking in the cultural field of forces. This says modernity. This says no longer hewing to the practices of an older print culture that says that certain things are supposed to be in capital letters. It gets a certain amount of attention. Hemingway obsessively bugs Edmund Wilson, who is a critic for the New Republic at this time, to review this book. Sends him a copy, pleads with him to review it. Wilson reviews it. That makes Hemingway happy. Wilson complains about the lowercase spelling out of the title and the author's name. This is a quote from the review. "It used to be rather effective when the modernists first used it to call attention to the fact that they had something new to offer. Now it has grown commonplace and a bore." And so when Hemingway sees that, he dashes off a letter to Wilson, attributing the decision about the all lowercase spelling of the title to William Byrd. "You were very right about the lack of capital letters, which seemed very silly and affected to me, but Byrd had put them in, and as he was printing the In Our Time himself, and that was all the fun he was getting out of it, I thought he could go ahead and be a damn fool in his own way if it pleased him, so long as he did not fool with the text." This is a bald-faced lie, because Hemingway is involved. Hemingway is in the room with the press, paying attention to the leading and the kerning. I'm going to look at the prose blocks on the page in a few minutes. Hemingway is intimately involved with every paratextual or bibliographic decision here, right? So he's totally behind the all caps, and he's throwing William Byrd under the tram. But if the type faces temporally forward, other elements here, like the colophon, face temporally backward. The colophon lifts up its eyes not only to the hills, as its Latin indicates, levavi oculus meon in montes. This is a quotation from Psalm 120, "I will lift mine eyes unto the hills," but also toward the bookish past via that Latin, via the hand-lettered inscription, the gestural representation, let's see if I can master this, gestural representation there of Paris's three mountains. Right? This is old-fashioned. This is archaism. This is what Byrd is really going to go nuts on when he gets to that draft of 16 cantos by Pound in 1925. We can get a clearer sense, I think. Oh, by the way, the red printing, I think, might even harken back to the rubrication that we're familiar with from medieval manuscripts and early print. Those significances are clearer when we compare this cover to the first two covers of uppercase In Our Time, the 1925. Oh, this is Smith's copy. It's copy number 3 of an edition of 170 inscribed to Ford Maddox Ford. It makes me so happy every time I get to go in and play with this book. This is the Bony and Liverite In Our Time in 1925. It's doing a very different kind of positional work. The title and the author's name are surrounded by testimonials from Sherwood Anderson here, and from Gilbert Seldes here, and from Donald Ogden Stewart and Waldo Frank. So that Hemingway now is showing up literally wrapped in the praise of his contemporaries, right? So positioning him in a literary landscape that's very different from, whoops, wrong way, from the literary landscape that this is positioning him in. Right? And it gets even worse and frankly inscrutable when you get to the 1930 Scribner cover. I cannot explain to you how the hell that illustration has, which is suggestive of romance and maybe enduring love, and there's this little gesture toward nature there. There's an almost proletarian realist look about all that. What this has to do with the stories or the interchapters that make up In Our Time thematically, I have no idea. What it does positionally is it says the Ernest Hemingway who Bony and Liverite introduced to you in 1925 as a writer worth keeping an eye on is a writer by this time. This is in the same Scribner edition that publishes the first edition of The Sun Also Rises, and by 1930, when this comes out, of A Farewell to Arms. This is Hemingway, who now has a reputation as somebody who tells stories of timeless value and of universal appeal. And so he's being positioned very differently in the mass market literary landscape by this cover, right? From the way he's positioned as part of a very small and avant-garde movement by the cover of that 1924 edition. Like I said, I'm not going to say everything that's interesting to say about these things in interest of time. I'm just trying to kind of highlight some of the cool bits. The title page is also great. You'll notice, for one thing, that it's got this frontispiece. This is positioning Hemingway in a particular way. This is by Henry Strader, who also did the illuminated capitals for the draft of 16 cantos in 1925. It's a slightly abstracting frontal view of Hemingway. This is a woodcut. There's a painting that Strader also made. That's this same portrait that's in the Museum of American Art in Ogunquit, Maine, which is a pretty place to go and see it. The one thing that I want to point out is just how busy the title page is. If you compare to the more typical, this is the Bony and Liverite In Our Time in 1925, it's doing that sort of gesture toward the proscenium stage that is a feature of title pages going back to the 17th century. So this is an invitation in, right? You move through this title page into the space of the book proper. We don't get that here. What we get instead is a repetition of much of the cover, the lowercase title and author's name, the colophon. The colophon is more detailed, locates us very specifically in Paris with a more specific address than we have on the cover. It's also got this weird little quotation that you can't read. It's a quotation from Hemingway's friend Bill Smith, a little snippet of conversation about what the girls in Paris are like, which is this kind of wink about Parisian modernity, right? You'll notice that then goes missing from the title page. It's still in this book. It's moved to the half title rather than the title page. But the space of the title page for Boney and Liverite is cleaned up and made more standard. It looks more mass market. This, is Hemingway kind of having his first book published in a familiar crowd. This is Hemingway moving into the kind of mass market position that he had always actually wanted. This is the Scribner, which is even simpler in 1925, but also comes with a testimonial because now there's an introduction by Edmund Wilson. Again, much more that I would love to say about the title pages. I'm just wanting to show you some sort of cool stuff. Along the way, and while we're talking comparatively, and this is going to lead into the last big point that I want to make, which is about what the book is made of, we could think about other modernist, avant-garde, small presses and the bibliographic differences that distinguish them and the kinds of modernism that are averred or claimed by those bibliographic codes. This is Hemingway's other first book. This is 3 stories and 10 poems. This is published by Robert McGowan's Contact Editions, located in Dijon, although it also often shares offices with Three Mountains. McGowan is constantly broke and a bad manager of money and his own correspondence and things like that. But you'll notice, other than the sort of sans serif type treatment, you got 2 different typefaces there. That kind of calls out to a certain sort of modernity. It's paper bound. It's a French fold cover. It's pretty heavy paper in a pretty simple blue. This is like the Contact House style. The paper is cheaper. I'll show you that in a minute. But these books sold for the same price. So the Three Mountains volume and this were both $3, which is kind of a lot to spend on a book in 1924. And this is McGowan saying the materials are cheap, but it's all about, as Contact had as its slogan and as its ambition, direct contact with the thing itself, right? It's a very Williams-esque kind of modernism that Hemingway is being recruited for here by the paratext of the cover. And so a different one from the more European-focused, archaizing, make it new by going back to the old sort of modernism that is associated with Pound. The dedication does its own sort of interesting work that is at once thematic and positional. I think if you look at the dedication to Hemingway's friend Chink Dorman Smith, he's identified by regiment, and that picks up the war themes of the book, that our time that this book is about is a time of war and violence and conflict. Stories are often about war and conflict. But then the dedication to McGowan and Bird, this Publishers of the City of Paris has a nice polysemy to it, right? So they are publishers located in the city of Paris. They're publishers whose publishing activities are in some sense producing the Paris that Bill Smith in that quotation on the title page is talking about and that Hemingway is joining and aligning himself with. And the comparison here, I'm not going to show you a picture of it. The comparison here would be to the dedication to the uppercase in our time when that comes out in 1925, which is simply to Hadley, to Hemingway's first wife. And we could talk here about like the type treatment, the alternation of Roman and italic, the lower casing of everything that's still kind of inscribing that modernity. But instead, we got to talk about paper. It made me so happy, Anne, this morning when you mentioned like the quality of paper on those covers of Angel Hair. And I wrote in my notes this morning, A.W. digs paper too. And I was so happy because like I love this paper. I love this paper so much that when I teach the book, I bought a sheet of the paper so that the students, the first time I taught the book, I was handing it around to the students and I was telling them, like, touch that paper is so great. And the librarian afterwards said, you don't hand the book around and tell them to touch the paper. So I bought a sheet of it, and now I like show the book and I hand the sheet of paper around to the students. So I'll tell you about this paper. The front matter identifies this. This is an edition of 170 copies. This is copy number 3. Identifies the paper in the volume as Reeves BFK, a handmade 100% cotton paper manufactured by the Canson Paper Company. It's 310 grams per square meter, or GSM, in the printing trade, which means it's heavy and dense. The higher the GSM, the heavier the paper. 310 GSM makes a paper that's almost vellum textured, it's warm colored, it's toothy, it is a luxurious commodity. And one of the most important things about it is how much of it they waste. Because in this book, it's one prose vignette per page. And some of them, like number 4, which is the one that when it shows up in the little review is subtitled Mons, very short, right? So a whole lot of blank, really expensive paper, which is an act of conspicuous consumption that I think is doing some important positional work in the field of cultural forces in which this book is being produced. So you don't get too much of a sense of the waste except here on the front matter. Compare it to the much less luxurious stock that McGowan is using, right? So this is paper that's not drawing too much attention to itself as paper. I mean, it's still pretty decent. The type bites nicely into it and everything, but it's not this sort of luxurious paper that you have here. Last little point that I'll make, and then one of 2 last little points that I'm going to make criminally briefly. Notice the lack of indentation, right? When it is published in Little Review, this is number 6 of the 6 in Little Review, it's indented. They're all indented. This is the first of the interchapters produced in Little Review in 1923. I think we could, I wouldn't want to lean on this too hard, right? But there is a generic cue that's being dropped by the absence of indentation that works together with the sometimes Steinian repetition or near repetition of sounds. In that same Mons episode, think of the potting and topping, right? We were potting them soldiers. It was a topping thing. Or the repetition of adverbs when soldiers who have erected a cool barricade are frightfully put out, right? That they have to leave it behind. Working in conjunction, these features, some textual, some paratextual, I think push us toward the prose poem. We're to read these as prose poems rather than as narrative or expository prose. And the prose poem is kind of the paradigmatic modernist form, right, from Baudelaire, modernist and Parisian form following from Baudelaire. So I think that some work is done by the smallest bibliographic feature of the absence of 3 or 4 blank spaces at the beginning of the first line of the paragraph. And then I just wanted to close with what's really cool about these lists at the back of books that I talked about before. So here we've got Hemingway in the conclusion of the series, now getting a title for what was blank when it was advertised in the Little Review, but joining William Carlos Williams, Ford Madox Ford, and Ezra Pound, right? So a kind of complicated modernist cast of characters. And Contact at the back of 3 stories and 10 poems, similarly locating Hemingway in Contact's stable. And this is something that's going to expand when in 1926 McGowan brings out the Contact collection of contemporary writers, in which the list is much longer, and Hemingway there is part of what we have to think of, I think, as Euro-Anglo-American modernism writ large. But that's all I'm going to say. I have no grand conclusion, except that I'm happy to keep talking about this stuff as much as you will allow me during the Q&A. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you all for being here, and thanks especially to David for the invitation to present. My presentation is a paper. It's a brisk walk through the hills with Susan Howe and her work, and I'll do my best to keep time. I have 50 images for you. I hope that's not too many. I like them. I hope that you'll enjoy them. It's all in the spirit of show and tell, of course. Susan Howe is a poet of colliding phenomena, And this is a presentation from someone who fell under an enchantment in the midst of a bookstore near the Willamette River on a rainy day. From January 1991 to August 1993, with the Portland, Oregon-based documentary film artist Vanessa Rennick, I co-managed the Small Press Journal section and the Dew Claw reading series at Powell's Books, the Burnside store. Collection development, ordering and pricing, sorting and shelving were orchestrated autonomously, often with endearing idiosyncrasy by the section managers during those years before computerized inventory. Our haptic and happenstance practices were immersed in tactile and teichic forces that we acknowledged and respected. There was an undeniable animist, materialist, vitalist agency dwelling among and between, within and through the books themselves, something kindred to what Howe, looking back on her writing of Articulation of Sound Forms in Time, would describe as the telepathic solicitation of innumerable phantoms. This was the context in which Susan's poetry and prose found me. These are some of the facts. I can't say for sure whether it was Mark Johnson or another colleague, maybe Wayne Pernew, who introduced me to the Weed 1987 edition of Articulation of Sound Forms in Time, and also to the 1989 Paradigm Press edition of Bibliography of the King's Book or Icon Basilicae, all in lowercase, very important there. I have vivid memories of my first moments with these books. These slim volumes were confounding and mesmerizing. They were audacious, fierce, and haunting. I had no way of knowing then what sorts of trouble, mostly good, these books were bound to bring my way. Both of these small press volumes, Articulation and Icon, were edited and revised in slight yet substantive ways and republished respectively in Singularities from Wesleyan in 1990 and The Nonconformist Memorial from New Directions in 1993. With hindsight, I can see now that these were concrete, social, polyvocal, strophic assemblages of colliding phenomena and factual telepathy, embodying major turning points in Howe's methods and materials that would shape her poetics and praxis in other works going forward, including essays such as Encloser, Sorting Facts, and Ether Either, and especially the books of poetry Pierce Arrow, Souls of the Labadee Tract, Frolic Architecture, That This, Spontaneous Particulars, Tom Tit Tot, Depths, and, just out from the Grenfell Press, Concordance. In all of these dialethic and dialogic works, we simultaneously see, feel, and hear the language through both sides of the page and across facing pages. In fact, this is crucial. Each instance of colliding phenomena across facing pages constitutes one poem, embedded within sequences of contextualized assemblages that invite our dialogue with inter- and intra-texts, recalling the Latin textus, experienced as woven compositions of sonic materialisms. In my reading of Susan Howe's work, these distinctive collagist typographic gestures of colliding phenomena and sonic materialisms first emerge in Articulation and Icon and the other works collected in Singularities and Tom Tit Tot, and the Nonconformist Memorial, haptic and teichic artifacts that are not quite yet present in her typescripts and published works from the earlier 1980s and 1970s, including her early word square broadsides, and this is one of those early broadsides. First exhibited in 1971, I'll note, at the Cornblee Gallery. These distinctive features emphasized in the collection's Singularities and the Nonconformist Memorial, which are similar to instances of dynamic cutting in film editing or of splicing in audio editing, emerge within context, beginning around 1985 and becoming more prevalent through the 1990s. During these years, Howe navigated at least 3 significant transitions in her prolific career: teaching full-time at the University of Buffalo, shifting from analog to electronic compositional practices, and migrating from small press publishing with presses such as Culture, North Atlantic, Aweed, Paradigm, Sun and Moon, to new relationships with Wesleyan, New Directions, and, for her artist books, the Grenfell Press. Such collagist facing-page sequences of colliding phenomena are also deeply informed by Howe's abiding interest in the nested, contested, palimpsestic synergies to be found in captivity narratives. From Secret History of the Dividing Line to Articulation of Sound Forms in Time, Kidnapped, from Coracle Press. Some of Susan's most fantastic books are from Coracle, by the way, in terms of recent publications, and over to Frolic Architecture. Many of Susan's poems, including History, have engaged the forms and tropes of the captivity narrative, especially Tom Tit Tot. And those reflections bring me full circle to the abstract you'll find included in our conference booklet. In her foreword to Depths, published in 2017 from New Directions, which includes Tom Tit Tot, Howe tells us that these collage poems emerge from many intersecting experiences and interests, materials and methods, including the Paul Tech 2011 retrospective at the Whitney and Howe's 2012 month-long residency at Boston's Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. However, Tom Tit Tot's path of multimodal transformations, while certainly kindred with those shaping influences, remains surprisingly unacknowledged within context of Howe's foreword to Depths. My presentation today follows that line of flight. After Tom Tit Tot's transformations from October 2013 to August 2017 and beyond, that is, from the exhibition of Tom Tit Tot at Yale Union Gallery in Portland, Oregon. One of the images from that exhibition is here. Through the publication of 3 books, Spontaneous Particulars, Tom Tit Tot, and The Quarry, 2 studio recordings with the composer David Grubbs, Woodslipper Counterclatter, their 4th CD, and a vinyl reissue of Thief, their 1st CD, and a sequence of Howe's lectures, readings, musical performances, interviews, and podcasts during 2013 and 14, plus an installation of Tom Tit Tot for the 2014 Whitney Biennial, not forgetting appearances of selected passages from the work in literary journals such as Hambone during 2014 and 15, also one visit that Susan made to Ireland during the summer of 2015, then the publication of Depths in 2017, and more recently, gallery exhibitions of selected facing pages from TTT in Brussels and Vienna during the summer of 2018. Of course, how can I possibly represent that activity, that robust, prolific path of activity within a 20-minute talk? But that is precisely the point and the rigor of beauty, which is the quest after Howe. Her work is always emerging from a very generative context of materials crossing and informing one upon the other. In other words, language escapes the works and vice versa on centripetal and centrifugal dimensions. Howe's works relentlessly problematize chronology, destabilizing origins and endings with woven, chiric, sonic image texts. Howe's vital intersections among archival sources, transcriptive processes, book arts methods, and materials thus recover, remediate, and regenerate languages and lives while also subverting their captivity by teleological, historiographic, and institutional frameworks. Tom Tit Tot alludes to an English variant of the German Rumpelstiltskin story in which these words, "Nimmy, nimmy not, your name's Tom Tit Tot," break the spell. Whereas the spinning of flax into skeins weaves the folktales plot, here in TTT, the collaging of words from images twisted from their original source, history scattered to the 4 winds, shapes Howe's transfiguration of texts into concrete poems resembling textiles or word whirls. There are 2 major collections of Susan Howe papers, one at UCSD's Mandeville Library, which covers the years 1942 to 2002, and one at the Beinecke Library, which covers the years 1998 to 2008. Both of those finding aids are available on the web as open access searchable catalogs. And then there's a comparatively small yet meaningfully selected collection of Susan Howe's artist books and first editions at the University of Denver. In addition to photographs from my own Susan Howe collection, my presentation today represents selected materials from UCSD, thanks to Rob Melton, from the Beinecke, thanks to Nancy Kuhl and Moira Ferguson, and from the Anderson Academic Commons at the University of Denver, with thanks to Catherine Crow, Michael Levine Clark, and Rebecca Macy. Among so many others, of course, at all of these great places, given the collectivist and collaborative praxis at the heart of any library's multifarious and multimodal forms of community engagement. One of those very discrete and so meaningful forms of engagement at the University of Denver is our library's annual application cycle for collection development grants. Several of which have given me the opportunity to work collaboratively with our special collections department to build our Susan Howe collection. And for one occasion, I had the opportunity to co-curate our 2015 exhibition of Tom Tit Tot within context of some of Susan's source materials and the work's paths of emergence and adaptation. Author of at least 40 books, last time I counted, and recipient of the 1980 American Book Award, the 2011 Bollingen Prize in American Poetry, the 2017 Frost Medal from the Poetry Society of America, the 2018 Griffin Poetry Prize as well. Susan Howe is a prolific poet and essayist, scholar and educator, visual and sonic performance artist. From her first published poetry collection, Hinge Picture, published by Telephone Books in 1974, to her sonic performances and studio recordings with David Grubbs, Howe's transdisciplinary and multimodal works embody dialogues among many different fields of research, creativity, and public engagement, especially theater, history, the visual arts, music, and book history, which perhaps underscores the combined influences of her mother, Mary Manning Howe, who wrote novels and plays, and had been an actress on the Dublin stage, her father, Mark DeWolf Howe, who was professor of law at Harvard with keen interest in American colonial history, and the poet's own studies of acting in Dublin after finishing high school, and painting at the Boston Museum School of Fine Arts, where she received her diploma in 1961. The decades of modernist materialities and methods celebrated here for this GBM conference and exhibition were also, of course, dynamic kindred influences beyond measure. And with thanks to David and Camille, I've just learned that there are at least 2 discrete artifacts in the GBM archive that illustrate moments of contact with the Howes. The earliest of those moments, which David highlights on page 41 of the exhibition volume, concerns the 1939 GBM launch of Finnegan's Wake that includes the legacy going forward of theatrical productions and literary adaptations, including the vinyl recording Expanding Cinema Presents passages from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, produced and directed by Mary Ellen Butte and published by RCA in 1968, which performance, as the album cover tells us, was based upon passages from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, a free adaptation for the theater by Mary Manning, Susan Howe's mother, the text of which was published in 1957 by Harvard University Press. The second of those moments of contact between GBM and the Howes concerns a book launch on May 2nd, 1983 for Susan Howe's defenestration of Prague from the Culture Foundation. These cross-disciplinary, multimedia, and transhistorical shaping influences upon Susan's work are multifarious, far too numerous to represent adequately in my brief talk today, but I'll try. From the abstract minimalism of Agnes Martin and Hilma af Klint, to the constructivist, expressivist minimalisms of Harvey Quaitman and David von Schlegel, from the early modern transatlantic legacies of captivity and conflict before and after Anne Hutchinson and Mary Rowlandson, to Emily Dickinson's fascicle manuscripts, of course, and also the vast collection of papers and materials in the Jonathan Edwards archive at the Beinecke, From her abiding care and studied concern for eccentric collectors and photographers, such as Thomas Smillie, and lexicographers, especially Noah Webster, pragmatists and semioticians, especially Charles Saunders Peirce, and Peter H. Haar. Kindred conflicted nonconformist modernists such as Liliane Niedecker, William Carlos Williams, Gertrude Stein, and Wallace Stevens, among so many others, not forgetting William Butler Yeats, not to mention the robust, enigmatic cohort of 17th and 18th century American Puritan theologians and historians and their artistic, literary, and philosophical inheritors, iconoclasts and animists, underscored within passages from Howe's great essay, Sorting Facts, all of whom, as she claims, inherited this feeling for letters as colliding image objects and divine messages. All of which, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings me elsewhere and otherwise anew to the gallery installation and world premiere of Tom Tit Tot at Yale Union, again, Portland, Oregon, October 5 to December 1, 2013. A collectively assembled, freely distributed catalog, Susan Howe, Tom Tit Tot, accompanied the exhibition. Yale Union concurrently published a chapbook, Tom Tit Tot, consisting of poems not appearing in the 2014 MoMA edition, unseen in canoe or cut glass, skiff to drift around centuries. In another room, during one evening, Howe and Grubbs performed for the first time a new sound work, Wood Slipper Counter Clatter, which emerges from Tom Tit Tot and would subsequently be released in 2015 as their fourth CD. Yale Union also concurrently released a cluster of open access digital artifacts, providing selections from Tom Tit Tot, the exhibition catalog, interviews with Howe, passages from commentaries on Howe's work by Grubbs and others, and related audio, text, and video links. These multimodal performances and open access releases of TTT marked just a few moments in the ongoing journey for this tricksterish collage of captivity, escape, and transformation in a stunning sequence of Howe's lectures, gallery installations, and publications, each manifesting a singular materialization for Tom Tit Tot, including the dynamic volume of textual montage, visual art, collaborative design, and production by Susan Howe and R.H. Quaitman, the poet's daughter. Of 67 collage poems, hand-printed at the Grenfell Press by Brad Ewing and Leslie Miller, and 4 composite images produced by R.H. Quaitman and Brett Groves at Axel Editions and at the Lower East Side Print Shop. The unpaginated book, measuring 12 3/4 by 10 inches, was hand-bound in green Japanese buckram by Mark Tomlinson in East Hampton, Massachusetts, and was published in 2014 by the Library Council of the Museum of Modern Art in a main edition and a deluxe edition. The colophon has much to say, but is silent about the papers, so I'm a kindred spirit. But I can attest that there's very high GSM, and the papers are toothy. But again, the colophon has a lot to say, but doesn't have anything to say about the inks, or especially about the variety of fonts that are on stage there from Howe's 21 source texts and their embedded embodied speech patterns in the collage poems. However, the volume does include a bibliography for those colliding phenomena of texts, contexts, and paratexts that deform and inform Tom Tit Tot's furious wilderness ghosts. Susan Howe often begins a composition with fragments of discourse, sometimes biographical or historical anecdotes, literary puzzles, cultural mythologies, and then stitches those narrative threads into a canvas of questioning and answering, always critically attentive to the role of language as a material, sonic, textual, and visual mediator of human experience, so deeply informed by synergies among elisions and erasures, morphemes and phonemes. Howe's wordscapes occupy charged figure-ground relationships where language self-reflexively folds through and across, against and within itself in recombinant, vitalist, materialist articulations of sound forms in time. Susan Howe's multimodal artist books engender and energize public encounters with infinite portable oceans in deft homage. Such a visionary and vital poetics and praxis recovers, remediates, and releases languages and lives, while also inviting our own multifarious collaborative encounters with tangible things out of a stark oblivion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David, for the invitation. All of you here have heard about books and pamphlets and journals and records and poetry readings. The postcard was missing. And the postcard is missing for many of you with a slight question mark. I can hear in the background the doubt, what does the postcard have to do with all of this? So what I would like to do now is give you a bit of my reasoning why the postcard is such a wonderful medium to think about modernity and even modernism. To do this, I will relate a bit on the Gotham Book Mart material, but I will have to go beyond it, and I will explain why. When Andreas Brown took over the Gotham Book Mart in 1967, he did not just rethink the store's range by offering more first editions, manuscripts, and autographs. Here we see him. He also added a field that seems to rely on mass production and showcased objects that were ephemeral at best. He traded in postcards. Most postcards are neither unique or rare. They are printed but made to carry messages and to be sent off by mail. And I would like you to compare this a little bit with the remarks we had yesterday about signatures in books. This is a medium that is reliant on writing and signatures. In the mid-20th century, there were certainly many collectors of postcards, but these were mostly people with small purses and eccentric tastes who met at special clubs or postcard exchanges, and not in libraries or bookstores proper. Serious connoisseurs would spend small fortunes on first editions, but even children could collect those postcards, just as they would start their own stamp collections. For the Gotham Book Mart, however, the postcard trade turned into an important line of business that could flourish even when the book trade did not. Brown emerged as one of the most prominent American scholars of postcards, moreover, collecting literature on the card's production and writing for newsletters issued by trade organizations. Brown's personal collection was well known, and sections of it are housed at the Getty Research Institute now, as well as other libraries. Brown would moreover serve as an advisor for other collectors. For example, he advised Leonard Lauder, an alumnus and great benefactor of this very university, who bought and donated many postcards to the New York Public Library, but offered most of his extensive collection to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Here we have him. The MFA has featured Lauder's treasures already in many separate exhibitions. While Lauder may be primarily known today as an art collector, responsible both for the founding of the Neue Galerie in New York and his transformational gift of Cubist paintings to the Met, his first gift as a high school student still was a small collection of early postcards that he offered to the Museum of the City of New York. Lauder's donations to these institutions indicate his major interest as well. These are just the catalog titles and posters of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts exhibitions on postcards of the Leonard Lauder collection. He collected vintage postcards from the turn of the century and the early 20th century. One generally says the golden age of the postcards, 1890 to 1920, that would reflect on historical events and carry artistic value. Brown, in turn, collected a wider variety of postcards. He was not only interested in postcards of the early period, but put an emphasis on Americana. Many of the cards do not bear an explicit artistic value, but stress the postcard's task to communicate. They document American life and American landscapes. He added, moreover, holiday cards and tourist view cards to the collection, as well as cards that feature technical innovations such as panorama photographs. Here's one of them. Quite clearly, Brown was especially interested in novelties, both new items depicted in various images and innovations of print production. He did not seem to collect postcards because of their historic value only, but because of the modernity of the medium. For us today, both names of Brown and Lauder are intertwined, as Lauder and a partner had bought the Gotham bookmark inventory after its closure, only to pass it on to the University of Pennsylvania. And let me pause here for two remarks. When you look at some of the books in the wonderful exhibit that the library staff had put together, you see books that are not only wonderful, important, and amazing, you see books that did not sell. That's why we have them. I might almost say, unfortunately, the postcards sold. As a result, we have a small collection of postcards, and basically a collection that does not fit together. It's not cohesive. These are the cards that did not sell at a boom. So we have cards that are slightly damaged, cards that are double. Some cards are wonderful, but they don't always relate to each other. So I want you just to think about this a moment. This is not a collection that was given to us. This is an unsold inventory. The second thing that I want you to think about before I continue with my topic is the gift by Leonard Lauder. Lauder knew Brown because of the postcard collection. He was a beneficiary not only of Brown's knowledge, but also of a lot of postcards that Brown owned, which gives you another aspect of why Lauder bought it and what we received. But it also puts a very strange point to our gift, namely it is the postcard and not the edition of James Joyce that made the gift of the Gotham bookmark to the University of Pennsylvania possible. I just want to put that in. The modernity of the postcard was recognized at its inception already, but it was not an American, but ultimately an English invention. The postcard's history commences with the issue of the penny stamp in Great Britain in 1840 that marked a change in the economic system of correspondence. Previously, mail was paid for by the recipient of a missive, not the sender. And while the cost of mail depended on the number of letter sheets used, it was largely calculated in reference to the individual mail service employed and the distance a letter had to traverse. The postal stamp brought a radical change. Mail was paid up front now, and most importantly, the calculation of distance for delivery was largely replaced by another measurement, that of weight. Weight becomes the key here. At first, however, the concept of stamping was not limited to a small square of paper to be affixed on the corner of an envelope. It involved the whole envelope itself, and the first official design was rendered by William Mulready, a member of the British Royal Academy. The first official stamp letter. The design shows Britannia, front and upper center, surrounded by symbols of imperial power that did not only refer to current colonies, but to colonies of the past as well. As you will note, William Penn is pictured on the upper right margin of the envelope in conversation with Native Americans. America was of interest as a former British colony. Mulready's envelope, this is basically the predecessor to the postcard, was ridiculed by many critics who proceeded to issue alternative envelopes with caricatures of the designs within weeks of this publication. I'm just showing one of this. Counter envelopes, and you can see this is making fun of Britannia and the lion and everything. But counter envelopes were not the only items produced in competition of the post office. In July 1840, a simple piece of paper addressed to Theodore Hook was graced with the new black penny stamp and put into the London Mail. Ladies and gentlemen, the very first postcard. On the back of the sheet, there was a hand-drawn image, a caricature of postal workers, no less, eagerly dealing with the new envelopes and stamps. The address of the sender was not given, but it can be assumed to be no other than the recipient of the card himself, the novelist and playwright Howe, who was always ready for a good hoax. The intended viewer or reader of this missive was therefore not the recipient of the mail, but the postal workers who had to sort and deliver. Howe was aware of an important fact. In contrast to an enclosed letter, there was no privacy that the envelope could offer at all. The message was public. Howe's mailing of 1840 is the first postcard we know of, and its true recipient were the people reading the mail en route to the delivery. When the Prussian postal official Heinrich von Stephan, I have to move now to the continent, which also partially explains Leonard Lauder's interest. He's interested in Austrian culture, but we are in Germany first. Be with me, stay with me. When the Prussian postal official Heinrich von Stephan proposed the introduction of a so-called open, as he called it, postal sheet to the Northern German Postal Federation 25 years later, in 1865, he could cite many reasons that would recommend the adoption. The postal sheet was light and therefore economical. It was thought to limit the flood of mail. Letter writing would be faster, and an emphasis on speed was an important point in a time of technological progress and the Industrial Revolution. He hoped that a limited writing space would promote a more concentrated writing style. Moreover, the postal sheet was to compete with the telegraph system by offering a cheaper and hence more democratic means of communication. This is basically a summary of his application for permission. So these are all official reasons given. In all of that, he repeated again and again, this invention was modern. In his proposal, von Stephan described a natural development from the wax tablets, where is Peter Stalibras when we need him, from the wax tablets of antiquity to the roll, to the scroll and the book on the letter, and finally to the postal card. The postal sheet was to resemble not so much the letters, moreover, but the recently introduced money order We are in the age of capitalism. It was the economical mode of communication and avant-garde in every way. Unfortunately, however, von Stefan's proposal did not meet with success. Government did not approve it. His new postal money order failed to satisfy the Federation's financial calculations. Publicly, however, the postal office cited a different reason for his rejection. So you have the official correspondence, doesn't make financial sense, and then you have the public advertisement. We can't do this because it voiced its concern about maintaining the mail service privacy. We are back with Hawke. What Hawke had already discovered was the fact that postcard communication could not be limited to the writer and reader, that it could easily be read en route and acquire additional addressees. Moreover, postcards seemed to transgress classes and the carefully established boundaries between male and female writers and readers. Thus, a postcard was hailed as modern and democratic, but criticized for a violation of social decorum. With the German effort, we are back in the area of morals. You see, this relates to our discussion again. With the German effort roundly rejected, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, we are back with Lauder, pressed forward and became the first state to approve the postcard for official mail delivery in 1869. This time, the proposal had been issued by an economist, Emanuel Hermann, for whom the calculations did make sense and who has been celebrated since as the inventor of the postcard. His innovation was greeted with much curiosity internationally and praised now for its utter convenience. Postcards could be obtained conveniently, written on quickly, and sent off easily. The postcard became known as an Austrian invention. But Germany's postal system followed quickly suit. With von Stephan rising in administrative rank, he became the general postmaster of the northern German states. The route to victory was cleared. In July 1870, the postcard was introduced officially in northern Germany. One side of the card bore a printed stamp and made place for the address of the recipient. The other side was reserved for the message. The sender's address was not to be included. Rules and regulations were added to make this new correspondence card legal, morally sound, and comme il faut. I beg you to have patience with German law and order. This is the first card. You see on the address side 6 laws that are not to be violated under the law. So to be, when you write postcards, please note. Has to be. The German states wanted to protect mail recipients as well as postal workers from offense. 6 rules were printed on the bottom of each card that was called a correspondence card. The new German correspondence card was greeted with some criticism. In contrast to von Stephan's predictions, people feared that it would lead to a deterioration of writing style and a decline of epistolary decorum. And if the cards could not assure privacy, were women allowed to use them? Did cards have to distinguish in size and colors to mark the gender of the correspondence, as had been previously done with the color of letter seals? In the years following 1870, books of etiquette were written that focused on questions of decorum in reference to the postcard and addressed questions of class as well. Was one allowed to write a postcard to persons of a higher or of a lower social standing than the author? Was the card too cheap a medium to be used by the upper class? By the way, the gender question was solved by Queen Victoria, who officially stated that she liked postcards. I have no idea where she sent them to. Once private companies began to issue them, cards were increasingly decorated with images, turning the postal sheet, now called a correspondence card, into a picture postcard. Most of these postcards are known as view cards and show geographical locations, but also advertisements or greetings appeared as well. The early postcards kept the separation between address side on the front and message side on the back, and they had image and text on the same side. This is one of Andreas Brown's collection. Here you see it together. That's, of course, possible because of the new printing possibilities. The text was to be inscribed by hand under or next to the mostly lithographed image, and text and image were to be read and viewed together. New printing technologies made this look possible, and here once again German publishers were ahead of the crowd. While Germany may not have been the first country to issue official postcards, it emerges soon as the leading publishing force in postcards. The old centers of German book publications, Leipzig, Nuremberg, Berlin, became centers for postcard production. German firms exported postcards to all European countries, to the colonies, as well as to America. Most of the early American postcards are imported. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 helped to increase the popularity of the postcard that was introduced shortly before the war began. For the delivery of mail during wartime, weight became all important. The French mail experimented with mail delivery of postcards via balloons. Pre-printed cards would be issued, moreover, and distributed to soldiers on the front. This assured speedy notices for them and easy censorship for the superiors. The negative side, it is public, is the positive side, easily to be censored. The lack of privacy turned into an advantage of control and supervision. Soldiers just had to make some marks on the report cards that referred to their state of health or location of service. Just a moment. This is German cards printed for various colonies. They are also in the Brown collection. And this is not in the Brown collection, but one of the cards where you just print off, I'm fine, and whatever, wonderful. These military cards did not only promote quick information, however, they also offered free writing space and the promise of the safest delivery route. It was the Franco-Prussian War, moreover, that would make images of postcards popular and offer means of propaganda. This is the very first picture postcard ever. It's a postcard of the Franco-Prussian War. Let me just make a remark according to, safety. Some of you know perhaps about the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, who was stationed during First World War on the Balkans. He wrote his main work, The Star of Redemption, on war postcards home to his mother, because that was a safe way of delivery of a manuscript. In the early years of the postcard, postal regulations were revised constantly, and by 1907, an important physical change took hold. Previously, one side of the postcard was reserved for the address, the other for the message. This is one of the address cards in the Brown collection. Now, the postal office would permit the printing of a divided address side since 1907. The long one is the back side of the panorama card that you've seen before, and you see the American image of Long Island printed in Germany. The postcard could change now from a correspondence card to a picture postcard proper, dedicating an entire side to the image. That made also the introduction of photography for the postcard possible. People began to collect these new cards with vigor, not for the messages, which became increasingly secondary, but for the image that became the card's major trait. And here also I want you to pause and think what we have talked about, autographing books. Most postcards collectors want pristine cards, no handwriting, even though these are made for handwritings. Books are not made, well, yeah, you can think about that. Postcards offered the cheap reproductions of pictures that were in turn standard size and could be placed in albums. This is also an early way for art historians to find out about the treasures of Italy. Postcards came before slides. And in contrast to stamp collection, postcard collection was first of all a feminine pursuit. It's only around 1920 that it changes. Germany, of course, became Germany, that means the German Reich, after the Franco-German War of 1871. Hence, view cards were crucial in promoting the national project and acquainting the German populations with the new imperial sites and with the new capital, Berlin. British or French citizens were in turn informed about their colonial territories, mostly via postcards printed by German publishers. And there was the rise of the tourist industry, with which the phenomenon of the postcard would be intimately linked. Between 1895 and 1920, during the so-called golden age of the postcard, almost 300 billion postcards were mailed worldwide. Germans were by far the most avid user of the medium, forwarding view cards of local sites and places encountered on travels, as well as cards for holidays and special occasions. There are even books of what to do with the cards if you have too large a collection. You put them on, you glue them on furniture, wallpaper. Postcards could moreover be stamped at post offices as a matter of dating only, without putting them into the mail, just to show when they were bought. And that's a practice that the French Republic for years resisted and then had to permit by public acclaim. Germany's dominance on the postcard market ended with another war. During World War I, mail services were restricted, and wartime was a setback for tourist travel. But it was Germany's final defeat in World War I that put an end to the country's reign on the postcard market, as firms in England, France, the United States, and elsewhere would gain importance. But there were other different kinds of postcards produced in Germany as well, that were the proper successors of Hooke's enterprise. And I'm now showing you different kinds of postcards that I'm working with that are, I think, linking with the topic of our conference, even though they are not part of this particular collection. In 1909, Rosa Shapire joined the group of artists called Die Brücke, a group of expressionist artists. She was not an artist, but an art historian. Schmidt-Rottluff, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Erich Heckel, Fritz Bley, Max Pechstein were members of the circle. Shapire encouraged these painters to use the postcard as a new artistic medium. The small, standardized format was to provide space for sketches and a quick dissemination of ideas. She wanted to encourage an art form that was both transitory and final, that could be viewed as a sketch and as a final product. Moreover, a postcard could integrate image and word, and sometimes on the same side. But as the divided address and message site was approved only recently, the postcard could now offer an entire site for artistic creation. If the canvas could be compared to a book in need of a shelf, the postcard was a telegraph. Simply by adopting the most progressive postal medium, Brücke artists would already join the avant-garde. And thus, Schmidt-Rottluff and Pechstein sent cards to each other and provided an internal postal system of communication, but also to Shapire, this is Rottluff to Shapire, and to friends and acquaintances. This is the backside. There are hundreds of these pictures. Instead of painting in oil, a process that would take days or weeks or months to complete, postcards were produced very fast. Often they were also rendered much advance to any posting as a form of speculation. Members of the Brücke bought blank postcards in bulk. With the help of the postcards, news were exchanged, artistic ideas traded, samples offered. The postcard influenced expressionist writers and their publications as well. Here is the postcards exchange between the poet Else Lasker-Schüler to the left and the painter Franz Marc on the right. This is such an important postcard on the right because it is also a sketch for a painting which was known as his masterwork but did not survive World War II. So this is the only thing we have. And we know that the correspondence is a matter of signatures as well in the images. Look at the stars that are moving from one image to the other. Else Lasker-Schüler, in turn, would take the postcards by Franz Marc and integrate them into her books. This is one of the postcards that appears as an illustration for one of her major books of 1919, The Malek. In my current project, I'm researching the role of the postcard in the conception of modern art, politics, philosophy, and literature. I have studied the material in Penn's own Lorraine Beitler collection of the Dreyfus Affair, for example. It includes pictorial documentation that was printed on postcards and distributed by mail. This was instead of newspapers, whole series documenting the Dreyfus trial that were bought either in bulk or individual and mailed. Some of this, again, you have this wonderful situation of Germans sending the postcards to France and then it's being sent back. And the Beitler collection also shows the earliest examples of anti-Semitic postcards. This is Émile Zola as a pig on the right, that were then circulated and back to Germany, where the visual language employed in the Dreyfus postcards became adopted in the other German postcards that were then popular until the 20s, where a large array of anti-Semitic postcards were published, among them a special genre called die Bäderkarten or Hotelkarten, postcards that relate on the exclusion of Jews from baths or hotels or whatever. The collection I'm drawing from here is the Walter Harnack collection in Berlin. At the time of the Paris World Fair in the late 19th century, the Eiffel Tower did not only provide a popular motif on postcards. Here you see this. Please remember that on top of the Eiffel Tower was a postal station. What you did is you went up to the top, you bought a postcard, had it stamped on the top of the Eiffel Tower and mailed, because postcards were just so damn popular. But there was something else that happened, that once you were up, you could look down on Paris. So there was not just the World exhibit as an exhibition site, but Paris itself turned into a world exhibition that was then photographed and circulated in postcards, among others by photographers like Auger. So I have worked with these images and their significance for Walter Benjamin, an ardent collector of postcards, some of which survived and are now housed in the Akademie der Künste in Berlin. And I try to give evidence that much of his arcades work and also the city images were driven by the postcards that he collected. I have written on the postcard writing practices of Franz Kafka, somebody who did not understand the switch in 1907 between one side and the other. You can see he is just in there. This is the card from Versailles being sent to his sister Ottla. And I'm also working on something else, the photography of Lili Krakauer. Lili Krakauer, the wife of Siegfried Krakauer, whom is better known as a film scholar. She was a photographer who was largely taking photographs that were unique, but that tried to resemble postcards. So you have kind of the opposite direction. When Sigmund Freud traveled, he sent postcards. And he sent postcards to his families and colleagues. And you shouldn't be surprised what he sent when he was working on his article of Moses. This went to Sandor Ferenczi. Krakauer's works is deposited in the German literary archives in Marbach. Kafka's postcards are a shared property between Marbach and the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Freud's postcards can be found at the Library of Congress in Washington, the Freud Museum in London, and the National Library in Vienna. Postcards are an inherently mobile genre, and my work demands much travel and frequenting of individual archives. It makes me happy to know that one major collection of postcards is close to home. I'm looking forward to include a discussion of some of Brown's treasure in my book on the postcard. Thank you.
Liliane, when you travel, do you send postcards?
No. But David, we also have to think what email and Twitter are doing these days and how they are declining everything. We don't really recapture, we don't have a sense anymore of what this new medium meant at the turn of the century. We just don't know anymore because it has become totally trivial. I think we have lost a sense of in how many different ways it has been used for different kinds of writerly or artistic production. So these are just a few glimpses that I wanted to give.
Two quick things. One, there was an article this past week on how young people are now adopting the etiquette that one should text before one calls with regards to cell phones. And I know, having two sons in their mid-20s, that that's definitely for them. And the other, which specifically speaks to Liliane's presentation, in the 60s, I worked as a dispatch clerk in the post office in San Francisco, and it was a ritual of new dispatch clerks to work what was called the postcard rack, because you would spend one day completely unproductive reading all the postcards, and you would never read a postcard again.
May I just add, this image is for you.
Well, I like the way you brought up the tweeting with the brevity of a postcard, but also the all lower case is ubiquitous today because that's how we search the internet. But I was really intrigued about the dropping of convention with the indentation, and with today's text, voice-to-text apps, it's really exhausting going back in there and correcting all those typos. The point is, how much convention can you drop today, on purpose or not on purpose? I've read some things that have been published and talked to the person who's put it on there and said, hey, what's with all the typos? And I'll say no one gives a mess about that anymore or something. And I know in college that's not the case at all. But like long verbose texting, like if there's an urgency to it, it's like, I know that's a run-on sentence, but I'm launching that off anyway. There's something, is that changing the way people are accepting the convention of writing today at all?
My answer was going to be, I don't know, and then I thought about Scott's paper, and I think Susan Howe is exploiting exactly that sort of boundary condition.
Right. When does it become like an art form or free association or jazz, you know, when you're just trying to communicate and on that urgent level, sort of? There's the immediacy.
It's a great question, and I don't think anybody really has the answer. Is this working okay? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But one thought I have in response is to say that, you know, whenever a writer or a printer, right, you know, breaks convention, the breaking of convention draws heightened attention to the materiality, to the mediation of the work, and that's one of the features that I really enjoy about Susan Howe's poetry and prose. Again, it's this strategic calling of new attention to the mediation of the work. And for example, in Frolic Architecture, there are these fantastic collage poems that I'm sure are familiar if you've been following Susan's work. That's published in This from New Directions. And those collage poems are artifacts that she has produced through a highly remediated process of finding transcriptions of Hannah Edwards's journals, for example, that were indecipherable to Susan. And she found the original journals she couldn't read, but she could read Lucy Wetmore Whittlesea's transcriptions of the journals. And so those artifacts from Susan's process of transmission are highly mediated, from manuscript original through transcription, through Susan's own typographic transcription, then to printed texts that she then prints and folds over and then Xeroxes and then prints again and then brings those remediated materials over to her publisher, New Directions. And so the technology has caught up with the methods in her case, but it's that renewed attention to, you know, breaking convention that calls attention to the remediation of the work, that heightens your sensitivity to the physicality of what's happening. I think that's true in texting too. You know, you see what's going on, and it calls your attention to the mediation of the artifact. You know, which platform is it? Is it a phone? Is it a blog? Because each interface mediates the material in its own way.
And there's a classic essay about printing that Barry Moser, who's the great illustrator, teaches printing at Smith. He assigns all his students, and the key point in it is typesetting, when done properly, is invisible. Right? All the labor that goes into typesetting, when it's done properly, is invisible. And so it's the violation, right? The legible impropriety that in some sense draws the attention, as Scott's saying, to the materiality, which makes me think in 50 years, there's going to be the release from some dark archive of all of our run-on texts, right, which will then be read by some scholar as, you know, evidence of certain things about early 21st century end of human civilization.
And we are already scared.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think on that note, we could take one more
On the end of civilization.
on the end of the note of civilization.
Thank you for the 3 papers. I just have a quick question for Liliane. Yeah, one of the things I think is interesting is, we still see in museums lots of postcards of artworks for sale. And I was just wondering, I mean, there seems to be different uses over time for the postcard and thinking about where people or why they decide to pick them up or what they do with them. I can say that we have lots of postcards we've never sent to anybody. I don't know why we buy them sometimes because it seems crazy, but there's this kind of way of remembering things that goes behind that.
I think the souvenir is of course an important thing. What I'm looking at is what my interest is right now, and I have to be very cautious. What my interest is right now is not the use of postcards, the selling, the buying, let's say after the great postcard age, because this is no longer for many relevant. But what it meant to have a postcard of a Botticelli or a Raphael in your hand without having been to Italy, and you didn't have the kind of other media that you had, or you could have your own picture gallery. And that was important then. So this is kind of what I'm trying to capture, that sort of innovation. And if may I say just what, is that okay? I don't want to. What I'm also interested in is that it's in the terms of art, that it was used not just to reproduce an image, which starts at the time when the photographic means are better. By the way, Italy is leading in that, not Germany, these art reproductions. But the question of, for example, with the Brücke, which is such a fantastic example, and people don't seem to look and care much about this, how the postcard has become not only a medium on which I produce the art, but also in which art circulates and provides a community so that these people keep contact with each other. There were actually in the 70s and 80s artists who have tried similar things like sending postcards and so on. So this has been revived with ready-mades. It's the time of the ready-made. This is the time before the ready-made. And that also bears the question, where should these postcards belong? The postcards of the Brücke are in the meantime in the art museums in Munich and Berlin. They're never all of them shown, but they're in art museums. The postcards by Franz Kafka, they are in library archives. So this is also very interesting to look into this genre decisions, which we actually have with most of the items here this weekend.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. I mean, one of the things you made me think about was the role of prints in an earlier period is doing exactly what these postcards are, what you're talking about, these postcards. So there's a move away from the print, but the print is a way in which the work circulates, and we've now postcard doing that.
Yes. And the reason why I named this in circulation is because I feel that this instability, together with the question of speed in writing, producing, and so on, is the side of modernity at that time.
Let's thank our speakers one more time.